Thank you, Professor, for doing this. I am really excited because I read your profile and I realized you studied at LSR and I also studied at LSR. So it's pretty interesting.
I I I did not study at LSR.
Oh,
Yeah.
no,
I
but your ResearchGate profile stated that you studied at LSR.
really. Okay, no,
Yeah.
that's a mistake. I went to LSR to take a few sessions, etc. I've taken a lot of guest sessions there, but I have not. I was not at LSR. I've done my undergrad from Christ in Bangalore,
Oh,
Christ
okay.
College. Yeah,
That's
yeah,
interesting also.
yeah.
Yeah.
I don't know. Maybe there is a mistake. I should correct that. Yeah,
Yeah. Okay. So we've gone over what Belong is earlier also, but I'll just give you a brief idea of what we do. So
yeah.
Belong is a community platform that offers discrimination-free services in the form of discrimination-free housing services, like we patch up with inclusive homeowners and clients who are in need of housing, who are in need of houses, and we patch them up without any restrictions or discrimination. We also have a Belong book club and library where we curate books on themes of diversity and inclusion. And lately, we've been having a lot of author reading sessions. So we also have something called the Belong Mental Health Collective, which we already spoke about, and the Research Collective, which we're a part of at the moment. And we also have something called the Belong Brand Against Discrimination, where we try to collate brands of trying to speak against discrimination. I anchored the collective, and we've had interviews with Professor Thorat, Professor Vikram Patana, Sanjay Kumar, Professor Ghazala Jamil at JNU. So this is, I think, our fifth interview, and really excited. So the format of the interview is going to be like I'll ask you some questions, and so this is how it goes. Sure.
Okay. Yeah.
Okay. So why don't you just introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about what your work has been like?
Okay. So I'm Shumona, and I am presently teaching at Ashoka University. I teach at the Department of Psychology. So before this, I was teaching at Ambedkar University in Delhi. Um, and prior to that, so I did my PhD from Jamia Millia Islamia from the Department of Psychology, and my work was particularly looking at the psychosocial outcomes of large-scale violence. And by large-scale violence, I particularly mean political violence. And so of course, I took Kashmir Valley as my context. The reason I got interested in that work, and that this probably will come up in the interview because I saw one of your questions was about this. But just to give an introduction, was that this is also about almost 8-9 years back, but I think the trend still continues that psychology primarily tends to focus on a lot of individual focus topics and a lot of individualized um, not just research but also intervention modules, right? So even our understanding coming from a pure psychology sort of framework, our understanding of violence is also usually that there's been work on intimate partner violence, domestic violence, childhood abuse, neglect, etc. But at that time I did not find a lot of literature that looks at the aspect of collective violence and how not just individually being affected by violence, but by being a part of a community that is victimized or oppressed or that has lived through violence, how can that affect me? And I think through the interview, I will mention some anecdotes which actually, which made me think of why I want to do this. But that's primarily what I was trying to study, that there is an aspect of collective violence. And thereafter, I discovered a lot of work. There's actually a lot of interesting work on collective violence, collective victimhood, collective memory. So all of these things which we believe are very individualistic, like something like memory, which is so cognitive and individual, but actually there is an aspect of memory which is shared. There's an aspect of identity which is shared. There's an aspect of all of this, right? So how does that kind of affect individual psychosocial outcomes? That was my primary work, and I was kind of I hope to question and argue against two sort of dominant um, trends that I saw within psychology, which I think we will kind of mention. So I don't want to. So yeah, I was looking at introducing this sort of a collective framework, collective violence framework, and also looking outside the very, very dominant trauma network, like psychiatric
Yeah.
network, psychiatric, not network, psychiatric sort of approach that
Yeah.
exists, a very clinical psychiatric approach, uh, not just in general, but particularly when it comes to um, mental health intervention in conflict areas. It's very, very driven by psychiatric clinical approach. And therefore, the argument is that we tend to leave out all of these other aspects of emotions and difficulties and several other constraints that the population faces, which is outside what you are going to identify as anxiety or depression or PTSD, terms like that. So that was my work. Then and after, so I've kind of been looking at largely intergroup violence and intergroup conflict and intergroup relations in general. That's my area. The courses that I teach, other than the basic courses, my electives are usually also around these themes. And present and more recently, I think over the last couple of years, or maybe I would say yes, last couple of years, I have become interested in studying, in looking at intergroup relations, intergroup violence and all of that, but in computer mediated communication. So looking at social media platforms and the kind of hate speech or the kind of identity performance that you see there, and why is it so blatant? And that's my question. And I want to examine some of the well established intergroup relations theories that we have, but all of that is it's not for virtual reality, it's for what we have known so far, which is face to face communication.
Yeah.
So I want to examine that. I want to kind of explore those um, variables when it comes to computer mediated communication. So that's my current work. Right.
Well, that sounds really, really exciting. And so, I mean, you've pretty much covered a part of what I was going to ask as a part of next question. You've been studying violence and conflict zones since quite some time. I also realized that your PhD paper, or all of it was, tilted toward understanding violence in conflict zones. So, I mean, you have more or less answered this question, but is there anything that you'd want to add as to what exactly triggered you to understand the mental health or the psychosocial aspect of violence in India?
Actually, to answer that question, a lot of these questions, when I was just quickly glancing over them, you sent them, so thank you so much. But like I said, I think a lot of those answers would be anecdotal, because I still go back and I think, when I think that, why did I study this? Why did I go there? What is the interest? A lot of it actually becomes, kind of personal experiences that I had. So the answer to this would be that when I was doing my master's, I used to have I write about this in the introduction of the book as well, because I think I keep going back to this. But I used to have a lot of conversations with a friend of mine who about, you know, just attitudes towards violence. Okay. I mean, these are just regular chai coffee conversations. But the difference was that, of course, I was coming from, and at that time, I was really not at all familiar with any kind of language or literature around identity and violence, nothing like that. Okay. But I was coming from where I came from, which is that I had grown up in Calcutta and then I had lived in Delhi. And, so that's where I was coming from. And he had grown up in the North Kachar hills of Assam, and had, as he was growing up, was constantly exposed, if not constantly, but consistently, several times exposed to the identity conflicts that kind of surround that region, and especially during the 80s, during the 90s, which was like a heightened phase, of the Assam conflict. So several times when we would have these conversations, I would see that how his opinions about violence in general were so different from mine. And in the beginning, it would just generally, I guess, annoy me that, our perspectives were so different. But I think that kind of drove me to understand that how growing up and being in different contexts influence such an, individual attitudes and mindsets. Okay. Because these were two individuals talking about something. But we kept going back to what our experience of violence has been, which compared to him, and especially collective violence, I had seen nothing. I had known nothing. I had just known from, I don't know, maybe television and films, right? So that really, I think that was the first time that I realized that I would like to question attitudes towards violence or understanding of violence in areas which have a history of violence, and how that can shape and reshape your identity, and that's why in a way how you understand violence. So the journey started from there, but I think after that, what because I was at Jamia, and I was very lucky because I had you know, two to three, quite a few actually, from batchmates and friends from Kashmir. So that was actually completely unplanned. I was still forming the question in my head. But when I started my PhD, I just had this cohort of people, many of whom were from Kashmir, and just by listening to them and understanding, that's when the particular interest in looking at identity and violence and collective violence and the outcomes of that developed. And that's why the interest in conflict areas. I don't think before that, I particularly thought that I would go to Kashmir or, maybe the Northeast. I knew that I wanted to, I mean, that was always my thing, that that this is what I'm going to focus on. Also, I think generally because the kind of literature and work we have, especially from psychology or mental health, in on these themes is very limited. That's also what I discovered.
Totally.
So that's I think, yeah, to answer
Yeah,
that question.
yeah, I totally agree, especially with the limited resources on mental health, because I come from Sikkim, and a lot of questions to me are directed on the basis of how they take Northeast as a homogeneous block, because they feel like, okay, so say there's AFSPA in Manipur, so they think that the entire Northeast is affected by that.
Yeah,
So I totally understand the idea of collective violence, and also the factors of context playing out in different
yeah,
within different individuals. This Thank you for a very insightful input. This question is really interesting. I mean, I found it really interesting. So your latest book, it proposes a kind of method that looks into analyzing the historical and cultural roots, and also going, further into, say, focusing on experiences of collective violence, because the objective was to decolonize psychological or mental health in India. So, my question to you is, why is it important to rely on such methods, and how does it help in creating discourses that affect inclusive changes in mental health frameworks in India?
okay. So I think the main reason that my writing, especially my writing, because also the book and how I wrote it was significantly after just the research, you see, because there were a few years in between when I also developed my own understanding and framework. So the book kind of really reveals, the book is much more recent. So it kind of, it allowed me to write from what I have gathered over my um, relationship with psychology and academia over the last few years, and the gaps and the advantages, all of that I have seen. So over the last few years, over my own reading of not just this topic but within psychology, and this why I write this really would take me back to critiquing the kind of psychology that has become popular globally, but also the kind of psychology that we tend to practice within um, India. Okay. And that obviously has a consequence for what we understand as mental health, what we loosely call, what mental health. It's just so loosely thrown around, and we only think of it in a certain way. But one thing that I discovered was that psychology always is, and the practice, and in this way research and praxis are always connected, because the kind of research that is happening within a discipline will inform the kind of intervention and the kind of interests that come out of that discipline, right? So I mean, for instance, ever since the research within economics kind of expanded into behavioral economics, and it has exploded. There's so many people looking at behavioral economics. You also see the intervention of that towards those areas, working with big, looking at health, looking at all of these different variables that economists are now looking at. It also kind of happened together. But so what I saw was that psychology is always late to the party in this. We're just so, and it's globally, it's not just in India. We're so, I don't know if it's a kind of complacency or if it's a kind of I don't know, a lot of people say different things, but we just tend to stick to certain kinds of models. You will find that very little psychologists are very few, not little psychologists are stepping out and doing interdisciplinary work, really taking from other disciplines like sociology, like anthropology, like international relations, like political science, all of this. And this cross disciplinary work, this kind of stepping out and looking at models from other um, viewpoints, which are not, say, individualistic, or which are not the psychiatric, or which is not kind of developed and makes sense in a certain context, which is usually a European or an American context. It's only now that more and more voices are coming towards this, okay, for this. But this has always been a kind of a constraint when it comes to mainstream psychological. We still harp so much about experimental work, right? But how do you do experimental work if you want to study collective violence? I mean, and what kind of narratives are, what is really affecting people? I mean, you can't. So this is the reason why, because we have always boxed ourselves in this kind of scientific thinking of experimental work and this and this and this. So we've always alienated everything else. And there is a growing need when we want to do work on topics like this and similar topics which many others are interested in and want to work on. You have to step outside, number one, disciplinary boundaries, which is exactly why I talk about history and context and the socio-cultural perspective. Because when I was writing about psychosocial outcomes of collective violence in Kashmir, there is no way that I could have made sense of any of it without looking into the context and history and the socio-cultural reality of Kashmir. I couldn't have done that. So, I mean, maybe as a psychology project, I could have done without it. You see, that's the flaw that I'm talking about. But in general, you can't make sense of how people are reacting to, in very psychological terms also, if how people are reacting to any kind of reality, violence being one. But how are they reacting to, how are they making sense of it? Why is it that it's, why is this experience gendered, for instance? Why there's so many aspects of it? How can you make sense of any of this without really looking at what that place is, what is the history, what kind of memory that place has, what are the expectations that the people have? Okay, so that's why one is to step out of disciplinary backgrounds and look at interdisciplinary work. I looked at a lot of work which is not from psychology. Of course, my main arguments were drawn from psychological frameworks, but a lot of books and materials that I looked at were anthropological, for instance, came from international relations and several other disciplines. So that's one. Second is to kind of then step out of this individualistic frame that I'm talking about, this trauma kind of psychiatric frame, and look at other experiences that exist, and therefore for also use other kind of methodologies. Not everything can be experimental. Look at field experiments, look at just just collecting narratives, look at qualitative work, look at several other. And now we have we can be very creative with our data collection as well. There is a lot of interesting work happening where they are using photographs and images and oral recordings to really understand. So there's a lot of things you can do like that. About the decolonizing is decolonizing psychological science is a larger movement, I would say, that's happening amongst a lot of psychology scholars globally, where they are talking about how so much of what we understand of psychological practice, and therefore mental health, and therefore everything related to that, is informed by models and research and concepts that have been developed in a certain context, and a lot of that can be questioned and critiqued, and also in fact become redundant when we are talking about post-colonial societies, especially countries in Africa, South America, and Asia. Okay, so there's a huge movement, you know, talking about that, and I think that is very, very pertinent when you are especially trying to study variables, mental health variables, which are so rooted in the context and history. One needs to follow an approach which kind of, I don't think it, I don't mean to say that you need to completely rubbish the theoretical frameworks, because I didn't. I adopted a lot because that's the only thing I could. I mean, my major scales and etc. were adopted from the West, but it is also about kind of being mindful and, being reflexive of what is working and what is not. And there are several interesting themes that come out which show you that this a decontextualized understanding of things like violence, of religiosity, of several other aspects that I was dealing with, needs to be reflected on and needs to be questioned. So I think it's a mix. By decolonizing, it really means, number one, more work from these areas. We don't even, because of lack of funding, because of opportunities of research, the kind of work that is coming out from these areas is also limited. So that is why we kind of lose out. But it's also about encouraging work and also encouraging more theoretical frameworks, more tools, more methodological tools that are rooted in how we want to do research in post-colonial societies. So,
Yeah. Yeah, whatever you said, it just reminded me of this one line that you used earlier of how there has to be a shift from individualistic focus on mental health to say understanding it in a from the lens of the community. And it also is important that we look it as political problems, because these are rooted in larger social systems, and that we have to understand. And this is how you've been able to manifest in research also, which is again really, really interesting. So borrowing from what you just said, and as a follow-up question, um, so because your research methods, like you said, were not strictly focused on theories, and were exploring various means of, say, one-to-one conversations, especially with people affected by trauma. So when you have such field works, and when you're talking to people who are specifically affected by trauma, what do you think are some of the key challenges that pops up? Uh, like because I mean, if I have to talk about my trauma, it is very difficult and also triggering to relive the trauma again, yet to talk to some stranger out there, who's again going to use that in research. So what are some of the key challenges that you think can pop up?
okay. I would just like to just say one thing, because we were talking about that, and I would like to not clarify but also mention that I think um, at this point I can say that I that this kind of, it's not really a debate about this individualistic or collectivist, the collective lens, but I think it really is much more comprehensive, which is where what we are trying, what I'm arguing for is that we can't dismiss that every individual perceives and responds in unique ways. But if we just focus on that, then we lose out aspects of the shared reality and the shared experience. So I think, more than saying that, yes, it's true that we need to look at, also we need to look at uh, collective or social realities which psychology hasn't focused on as much. One being political aspects, second being social realities, third being, for instance, identity, fourth being experiences of discrimination. So that all of that needs to come into. So I think it becomes a much more comprehensive model where we don't dismiss the fact that, even if, for instance, if I am in a community, I am a woman, for instance, I identify as a woman. So gender is very important to me. Yet, if you take another person who's probably had exactly the same kind of gender experiences as I had, would still might have different opinions and different attitudes than me. So there's always that interaction between my social identity experiences and those individual kind of nuances that I bring to that. So I think that is very interesting about identity, and the way that I'm trying to understand identity here in after, especially when I look at identity in context of conflict. Really, most of my work is there, is to really understand there's this interaction between how individuals take collective identity and the history of that, whether that's of oppression, discrimination, or of privilege, and guilt sometimes, and but how that interacts with how the individual makes sense of their identity. And I think this is what the kind of framework that I find really interesting. But coming to your question, I think I would actually I just want to mention this because I spent a whole lot of last year actually working with a colleague. Her name is Rashmi Nair, Dr. Rashmi Nair, and both of us she works on collective victimhood. She did her research in amongst Dalit and Muslim men and women in Delhi. And because both of us worked in these kind of contexts, so we actually wrote a chapter exactly on this, which was challenges and how to navigate the challenges of doing field work when it comes to topics of collective victimization in India. And I think I'm just mentioning that. I think the chapter should be out soon, but that's something that maybe we can also use. So I'll just quickly refer to that and what I put in there, because there were so many things at that time. I went, I kind of looked back and thought of all the things that that I had experienced on the field. But what could be the challenges is that number one, I think, is what I would say, and I do feel, because I'm teaching students now, but I do think that students have a lot more access to methodological tools, etc. now as compared to then. But I do think that no matter what method you want to do your study on, as in it can be a qualitative or quantitative or mixed or something else, but when you are doing field work in general, but particularly when you're exploring these questions, it's always better to leave one part of it open. Like, I don't think you can go with a very set and strict format for fieldwork or questioning when you're working on these questions. And I think that's one thing, that it's better to be prepared for it, because sometimes you will go to the field, it happened to me, and you just come out with just a whole different thing that you want to do. Because we need to be mindful of the fact that, especially if you're going to work on identity based discrimination and in areas which are affected by conflict, no matter how much you read up literature or other materials, you will not be prepared for the kind of experiences that you will have to witness because you're talking. Okay, you will not. No one can be prepared. So in a way, it will throw up all the academic settings that you have done. So it's always better to be prepared. Sometimes that can be a little overwhelming if you're a young researcher, but so it's better to be prepared, which is, and in prepared, I would say that that you go with a certain idea of what you want to do, but always leave room for the fact that it can completely change, especially when you're studying this, because our understanding of what violence is, of what these experiences of living in places like this are, is so limited. We don't have an idea for, and that's been a historical truth. I mean, there has been an alienation, so we don't really understand what has been the day-to-day experience of that. So that's one. The second challenge, I actually, honestly, when I was working in Kashmir, I didn't face any challenges, and that's the reason being that I had a very good network. I was very lucky because number one, uh, I was supposed to just work with the students in Kashmir University, but because I was living with a family, all those other conversations that I talk about came from there, which I didn't expect. So because when we would sit down to have our meals is when they started talking about their experiences, and that meant so much. I didn't, if when I was going with this pure academic frame that, oh, I need to conduct my, I need to give my questionnaires like this, so none of other conversations should come into the picture, but they did, and they really helped me. So that's one. Second is, I knew people. My friend was working, so I had my friend was working in Kashmir University, so I went there. I just spent a lot of time there. I reached out to students. Of course, there was, some one-off questions where there were some participants who were hesitant. There were especially, and I don't think I realized it then, but I think it's in retrospect. And especially when I was writing the chapter, I realized that I was also an Indian woman working there. So it's a very it is so many things to explore there. But on the surface level, I think a lot of the, because I was also working with students, they are the very active sort of part of the resistance movement in a way. So they want to speak, they want to tell you what they feel, they want to tell you what the experiences are. So as such, I didn't face challenges, but I think these are some of the things that you can always, one thing that I must mention, and I think I do write about this, is that also when you are, and this can be a challenge, we don't think about it. For instance, I went back the second time. I went for 2 months. When I went back the second time, my stay was had to be cut down because things had become volatile. So there was an incident that happened there, and right after that, which was not connected to anything, but in places like Kashmir, when anything happens, anything can happen. And at that time, I remember the family I was living with, because everything. So we know what lockdown is now. I was just talking to my Kashmiri friends who basically have been living in lockdown for a long time. But of course, I had an experience, and what happens is when you have a curfew, everything shuts down, like the transport and everything. And so they really helped me out to reach the airport. They asked someone who had, I think, an auto rickshaw or something to try, because everything had shut down. So I had to cut down my sample, which really which made me very sad, because I had some idea of doing this model path analysis for which I needed, I don't know, a certain sample size and all that. But those things really, later on don't matter. And so I used to think that how will I present my work with just this much sample and all that. But these are real challenges. And that's what I mean, that if you go with that kind of a very rigid framework of, I need to interview so many people, I need to complete this, it will be very difficult. It can be disappointing. So that's why there's all, leave some room for just exploring, and it's okay if
Yeah.
you don't get to do so many, and these challenges will come up on the field. So I think those are some of the challenges.
Yeah, those are very interesting inputs. I mean, like earlier when we were talking about how the process of unlearning began ever since you met your friend in college, and even when you were even when you were there to conduct interviews, there was so much unlearning as a process happening, which came very handy when you started writing your book and your research. So that is definitely very interesting. You have done, like, we've been talking about violence and how it impacts one's mental health since long time, and you've written like a whole book on it. So I don't think it'll be possible for us to cover everything. But if we have to break it down into simplest form for anyone who's watching this, how would you talk about violence against certain group or identities, and that affecting the social psychological dynamics within the individuals in the community?
Unless we understand how crucial and how important aspects of identity are to individuals worldview, to individuals understanding of themselves and the world, we will not really understand that how identity based anything, identity based privilege, identity based discrimination, identity based oppression, all of that can affect someone, that it can be so fundamental to an individual's, not just mental health, like um, being, in a way, right? So I mean, this is something, it might sound very, I don't know, it sometimes sounds abstract or philosophical, but it really isn't. It is that when you are living in a place or having an experience where there is constant identity based violence against you. I mean, and this is, for instance, the reality that a lot of women will talk about, that when you sit to think about it, many of us don't, but just the you know a lot of these conversations came out, for instance, after last year, when people were writing about their experiences during Me Too online. And one of the things that you kind of reflect is that that, you know, one of the things that I saw were there were some people, many of whom were men, who were coming and writing that if you have, I don't understand this, if you have been molested, why don't you go and report? Why don't you go? If you have been raped, why don't you go? And things like that. And of course it was extremely angering, but you know, you want to have a conversation, and I think I tried to with one person because I was really angry, but then I let it go. I don't like to engage because I know it can go. But I just said that, I mean, what are you going to report? The fact that yes, you are taking these two experiences, which are extremely important, but please do remember that the victimization and the violence of this identity is not just restricted to that. The fact that every day I have to think just for a split second more if I have to go out at night, or I really have to think about, should I wear this if I'm going to that part? All of this is my identity violence. Okay, so all of this is violence. The fact that if I'm a little bit late to catch the metro or whatever, there's this vague sense of apprehension that, oh, you know, I should just rush home. Where is that coming from? It is violence. The fact that I need to feel fear, you know, when I am. It's the same experience when you are, you know, when you talk about whether being in Kashmir or whether being in other areas, but this fear that you learn to live with, okay, that is the most important part of, I think, identity related violence. And I think one of the mistakes we do is we only tend to understand identity based violence and discrimination in these very, you know, like keyword overt terms, like this guy was talking about, right? Or like when people talk about, when they talk about Kashmir, just like, you know, certain things, but it really isn't. It's so much deep seated, it's so much more, and we really need to uncover those experiences, which is what I was trying to do really, through my work and through some of the paper, you know. So, you know, for instance, one work that I did with my professor, Wahida Khan, which was, we wrote on the qualitative, on the meaning of violence. Like, even violence is like a term that we borrow, right? We think that, okay, this, like, for instance, when this guy is saying, he only thinks that only rape and molestation can be violent, for instance. I'm sorry for using, you know, difficult words here, but that's the only way I can explain this. But it is so much more. So to really understand that it can be so much more, we need to first explore what are those other experiences of violence, which can also be very violating, which can be very destroying in a way. And so I think through research, we need to uncover, particularly when it comes to identity-based discrimination and violence, we need to highlight those other experiences, that sometimes it is not just this, it's so much more. And second is then think about interventions to address that, because we don't. Like I said, when we talk about interventions, at least in conflict areas, so much of interventions that we see with gender-based violence also is directed, for instance, social legal frameworks, so domestic violence, against dowry, etc., etc. But when that experience of violence is so much more, uh, you know, it can't just be these are great and these are very important and instrumental, but we need to expand, go beyond that, and understand that what can be these other experiences of violence or identity. I hope that
Yeah.
that was as precise as I could make it. I don't think I can,
Yeah, that was
talk about
wonderfully
it.
put. Yeah, that was wonderfully put. I think it really made sense. Talking about women, my next question is also about women, and like your book discusses how when there's a focus on conflict zones, there's also a huge there's a participation of military, and which also kind of shapes conflict zones in a particular way. So in conflict zones, the portrayal of women and the women, like the way women are represented as always being the victim from a particular male gaze. I think this is also kind of covered in your book. So my question to you is, how do these types of framing, like representing women as a victim, always affect their mental health? And and the fact that living in conflict zones, your access to resources is already limited, so how does that play as a factor for women living in conflict zones?
I think I've actually, um, when I went in to do my work, gender was not, of course, I was very, very underinformed and not prepared to actually say this, but it's true. And I always admit it that gender was not one of the things that I was doing. I was like, I didn't even expect that it is going to play out in any significant way in my work. But when I came back, I think um, it has been one of the most significant themes that have emerged from my work, because I think the first paper I wrote after I came back was on gender. There's a whole chapter in my book on that. Several of my discussions and talks that I've done, presentations that I've made, have been on that. So it's been a very experiential learning for me, I would say. When we are looking at gender, and that is because, as simply as that every experience in life is gendered in the world, and therefore conflict cannot be removed from that. And it is in fact more so because, just like every other experience is, when things get difficult, it just gets more difficult for women. It's as simple as that, I would say. Um, and I don't think there are a lot of anecdotal, again, experiences which I mentioned in the book, but I will not go into that because I think it'll take too much time. But what I would like to say is that there are many others who write much um, more expertly and comprehensively on gender, specifically gender in Kashmir. Like there's Seema Kazi, there's others who've really written about it. Uh, but I think what it has essentially done is just a removal of the woman's voice in terms of um, exactly these other experiences that define and that describe what the experience of violence is. So, that narratives are framed like that. Like when they are framed for you, you don't think that that is not you. So when you just reiterate the same narrative, but you never question that. I mean, this is true for gender narratives everywhere. I mean, that is just you believe that that is also what you are doing. So the removal, of course, that it is a South Asian society where, or any kind of society where women have been much less participative in the political and social realm. So there's a historical thing like that. Second is, so that's the first reason. That's one reason that they are disproportionately less visible, whether it's the protests, whether it's everything. When you see images of Kashmir, how many women do you see? Even though there have been groups, yeah, a lot of people are quick to say that no, but you do see women who have kind of support. Yes, but that's still very, very marginal. Let's be honest, okay? Second is that because of the militarization and the fear related to that, we are not unaware of, the several cases that have emerged, the level of military violence, especially sexual violence against Kashmiri women. What that has done is that it has even more so kind of put them, because now it's become a question of safety. So anyway, their kind of visibility was low. B, because it's now so unsafe to go out and stay out, say later than a certain time, that's like a double this thing. Even though actually, that a lot of Kashmiri women, it wasn't like that. I mean, for instance, in Kashmir, for instance, the level of education is usually tends to be very, very similar between men and women. A lot of women actually, their marriage age is also much later compared to a lot of other states in India. So it used to be a lot of women drive, for instance, there. Okay, so I'm just trying to give a sense that, but because of the militarization, because you brought it up, that how much of a seclusion women have faced. So I think it really is, and I think there are much better accounts of this. But what I feel is that while this understanding of women who have been victimized, definitely, whether it's sexual violence, whether it's alienation, all of that needs to be put forward. It's very important, but understanding them only in that role is the same thing, is the same mistake that we've done with women historically all the time, where we read about wars and we only know about women as, I don't know, like the woman that was left behind by the general or something like that, but that is why we know nothing about what the women were doing, what they were feeling, what kind of violence they were experiencing, what kind of emancipation they were experiencing. In fact, there's some interesting writing, this we've seen all through our big global wars, but also in Kashmir, where a lot of women were actually forced outside to earn when the men were missing. So how did they cope with that, and what did it mean when the men came back, for instance? There's one of the biggest example is APDP, which is the Association of Parents of Disappeared People,
Yeah.
and now it's parents and wives and relatives in general, and the kind of work that they've had. But when we look at women's resistance, for instance, when it comes to Kashmir, also Manipur, and several other areas, I think that's one topic that needs to be spoken about, that how resistance has been framed. And when we look at these particularly women's resistance movements, we'll see how different they are from a lot of other resistance movements also, in a way, because there's a certain framing which is coming from that sort of a narrative of that is being framed by the women and how they understand the violence. So I think looking at that, so I think we need, I mean, in the sense, the fact that there are a lot more other complex experiences of violence that women feel, and it's not just this one victims of sexual violence, which we tend to talk about. It's not just Kashmir, it's everywhere. When we think about civil wars in Africa, when we think about the, Balkan wars, so much has been written on women who were raped. And it's a very difficult experience, because women were, I don't want to go into that. That's a whole different thing. But yes, but it's also about looking at women participating in resistance, and women who are not, but what is the experience of this seclusion and this loss of voice? So I think, yeah.
Yes, again, very, very insightful. We probably were talking about how adjusting experiences based on particular context, which has also been the recurring theme of our conversation today. So, speaking about interventions, so we spoke about how violence, identities, all of these are a part of larger social systems and deeply political, and but responses to those have somehow been restricted as not really social and political. So, like, I'm talking about, UN conventions, and say the Mental Health Care Act. These have been focusing on very. I mean, it's good that it's focusing on individualistic aspect, but it's only restricted to individualistic aspect. So, my question to you is, what are some of the shortcomings of such acts or responses, and how are they, detrimental in understanding the progress of mental health in India?
This also is reflective of the kind of framework that is existing within mental health practice as well. And I think this is one thing that, as mental health practitioners and as the community within academia or practice or policy, this needs to really come from there. I mean, I think unless there's more and more work which supports this, that you can't understand individual mental health by separating the individual from the context. I mean, so there just needs to be more conversation about that, more publication, more, all of this, which is actually, for instance, there are a few group of social psychologists, that there's a group of social psychologists who are kind of doing interesting work on several of these identity based experiences. And that's one thing that we keep talking about, that it's about bringing these insights and these findings to some platform, so that, because right now, that since that doesn't exist, we still continue to view mental health as so separated from the social context, that any kind of policy that's happening on that follows that module, in a way.
Yeah.
So I don't know why. I mean, I'm sure that there are people who are open to, who do see the fact that they can't be separated. But it continues because there's not enough push behind that. I think there's not enough um, evidence or push, or, that's what I would presume. I mean, of course, there could be other influences or other factors, but unless we look at that, unless we bring in aspects of identity and collective identity and the social context to really understand health in general, and of course mental health, then I mean that's the whole point of, I think, public health and public policy. In a way, I think that's what I believe is, I don't really know, but when I think of public health and public policy, I think it is the matching of these individual health kind of perspectives with larger sort of questions around whether it's climate change, whether it's environment, whether it's social you know the kind of social status or the social opportunities that you have and how that affects health. So it's not that there isn't work, but I think there just needs to be more push from the scholarly or academic or other bodies towards that kind of policies and laws, if you may say so, which actually uh, you know kind of supports this argument. Otherwise we will, I mean, the main thing is, otherwise it will always be a shorthand intervention. I mean, it will never really be able to achieve what we seek out to achieve. Even if the intention is right, you won't be, because you're not addressing what the underlying issue is, right? So
Yeah.
if you are moving towards looking at why so many farmers are committing suicide in certain regions of India, and then you look at it as an individual family problem, for instance, you will never be able to get an answer to that, because it really isn't. It's so much more than just that one person. It's a social problem. Of course, it's a much larger shared constraint of living and oppression that this is against. So yeah,
Yeah.
I think.
Yeah. So talking about like we were talking about earlier, we were talking about how there's very limited resources and research available on the impact of identity, violence, and it's like on the mental health. So I feel like if you have to talk about psychology as a practice, like a lot of therapists lack the very idea of engaging with clients of very different identities. Like if I'm a man, like I might not have the required training to engage with a cis woman, or like same with other identities. So what do you think are what do you think are the reasons behind this gap, that we still don't have resources and our therapists are not actively trained to engage with issues of identity?
There are two gaps. One is one main gap is that mainstream psychology training continues to draw from. I've already spoken about it, so I will not repeat it. But because a lot of the kind of training, the kind of language that we are learning, the kind of approaches that we are um, sticking to doesn't prepare us to really look at that, unless you are particularly delving into those fields, just like me. And I don't think I would have been a very good therapist if I had taken that path, because I wouldn't. But yes, so a lot of people, so it's just that mainstream psychology training is not preparing you for that. In fact, mainstream psychology training, that's what we are trying to kind of shuffle in our classroom teachings as well, by bringing in uh, you know questions from around the world. For a long time we didn't. For instance, when I was studying, I didn't. No one asked me to question realities around me by applying. So when you don't have that sort of training, you will not practice it when you practice it. So that's one. Second is that it's that vacuum. Yes, so it's the kind of vacuum that that clinical psychology and therapy continues to be in, that you think that to be a therapist you only need to familiarize yourself with the method of therapy.
Yeah.
But I must say that this is not true for everyone, and I've actually seen and interacted with people who I've seen that difference in. Of course, I have friends who are therapists. I have worked with people who practice therapy, and I've actually seen that. And it's reassuring that not everyone is like that. There are therapists who use their experiential learning, who use their own privileges and are aware of that, as well as their own identities and how that kind of interacts. And they actually engage with that, and they use these eclectic ways to practice their own therapy. But there are many more people who believe that it's the training that they've got, and whichever method that is sufficient to deal with. It's a very vacuumed out space. It's as if when someone is coming with questions around identity, with issues, with a suffering that is related to anxiety to you, it's as if you can address that only with that. And there's nothing else about that person who the person is, who she or he identifies with or otherwise, who, which language that person speaks, what kind of social, as if those things don't matter in a way. And I think unless we are able to, and this is a thing that needs to start from training in psychology, like right from, I would say, college or even maybe before that. And these are just general conversations which need to come into therapeutic practice. One other issue, disciplinary issue, is that academic research and praxis is also not as well connected as it should be. So even though there are a lot of people in academia who may be raising these questions, there's no, I mean, it's not like the people who are practicing it are getting to know about it, or there is an active conversation between these two communities. I mean, that's my biggest complaint about academia, that we just sit in our offices and do very interesting work. That's great, but for what? You need to take it out there and connect it to policy or connect it to intervention, or talk about these things with therapists who are actually practicing and interacting with clients. So I think these are the two gaps. One is the kind of training, and the second is the interconnectedness or the coordination between theory and praxis. So the theory may be there or may be being developed, but there's just, if we are not together in this, there's no way that we'll be able to address that. Yes.
Yeah. Where my second question was asking to you about some of the approaches for inclusive mental health practices, but I think with this response, it covers that also. So if you'd want to add, we can go over that, or do you want me
what
to
was
skip?
the question? Sorry.
So the question is basically asking to you about what are some of the inclusive approaches we can adopt to make mental health more accessible. But I think your response kind of covered that also.
Absolutely.
Yeah, so we'll just skip the question.
Yeah, I mean, I would just like to say that inclusive approach, inclusivity and what it means and how it can be practiced can truly be imbibed if there is enough conversation and awareness about it. So I have a problem with using inclusivity just because that's the thing too, just like diversity, just like, and I have a real problem. So what really, what are the challenges of inclusivity? That's another thing that we need to be aware of. What can be the challenges? How can we go about it? What is probably a better method? These are conversations that need to start, as simple as that. And it's happening, but it's happening in very, I would say, spots here and there. I would say that, for instance, Ashoka, there's a lot of conversation around that, which is great, but it's one of those just spots. So the more conversations, the more, and I hope, platforms like Belongg and others can really take that conversation, steer that conversation forward, and bring practitioners and scholars together to talk about this, and then hopefully go towards the direction of informing policy and intervention.
Yeah, makes sense. I think we're almost towards the end. I mean, I have last two questions that are very general in nature. So we've spoken about your interest, what you're currently engaging in, and what you plan to do. So one specific question that I have is, what are some of the open research questions, that you've been meaning to study, or something that deserve more attention at the intersection of mental health and these identities?
I would say there are two, both of which were questions for hopefully that I thought after my own work that I would be able to pick it up. I don't know if I will be, but I think they are important questions. The first is to use methods to discover the meaning of terms that we use very universally. That's the word. So what I mean is violence, trauma, identity. Okay, so I think there's a need to deconstruct that, and contextually, I mean. So when we are doing context specific work, I think instead of going with a questionnaire or an interview, schedule or a scale which assumes or presumes the kind of trauma or violence you've experienced, I think we need to have methods to discover what is the violence that you've experienced, or what is trauma for you, or what is identity. So I think that is, I think that approach really needs to start, because that's the only way we can have multiple narratives of trauma. And I think that's one thing that for me has been the greatest learning from my field work is that there is never one story of even victimization. We tend to, particularly be close-minded, or we tend to particularly be consumed by a singular narrative of victimization and trauma because it's very overwhelming. But the reality is that unless we can look at alternate stories and alternate narratives and alternate meaning of what that is, we will not truly really understand what these different experiences. And marginalized narratives will always be marginalized. For instance, gendered narratives, for instance, narratives of, for instance, age groups, because there's so much work, for instance, in Kashmir, looking at the youth. My own work was, but when I was speaking to these other people who were 40, 45, 50, they had a completely different narrative. Okay, so that's what I mean, and I think that's a very. So I think one way to do it would be to go with methodologies which are open, which are grounded, I would say, and maybe mixed method or otherwise, which would kind of help to redefine what violence and trauma and these terms that we take for granted are in that context. That's my first thing. The second would be to look at so I kind of, when I present, I create this really complicated, complex looking model that I say that the individual is here and there are all these many layers and the context. And so, but there are many layers in between. But that in between is what we are figuring out. So when we, so for us researchers who are working on the individual outcomes of large scale anything, realities, conflict being one, but there are several others, political um movements, or even just things like polarization, populism, identity. These are all large scale things. There are many intermediary aspects. There are many intermediary variables. We tend to think that this relationship is very linear, that this affects this in one way, and it doesn't. So that gap in between, I think, would be the open question. Many of those things, for instance, are something like in my own work, it was, for instance, mindset or support for violence, or so in the sense that not everyone who is experiencing violence themselves practice violence. That's an assumption we have, right? That
Yeah.
people who are exposed to violence themselves are very aggressive. Okay, but it's never, number one, that's not true. And the relationship is not that linear. So there are many things in between that affect that. One of that is an inherent is a mindset towards violence, and we differ in that. So I might have a mindset which is very supportive of violence because of several reasons. For me, this relationship might be very, very strong. But for someone else who doesn't believe in violence, this relationship will not hold. No matter how much experience of violence I have, I will process that information in a different way because my mindset is different, and therefore I will not be supportive of violence, or I will not be aggressive. I might internalize that. I might be much more, it might come out as other aspects. Maybe for instance depression. That's one thing that I saw, that because I've internalized that experience of victimization because I don't support violence. I hope that's making sense.
Yeah,
So
of
I
course.
think these intermediary variables are open questions. There are many things, there are many aspects to that. uh, What I mean is there are multiple variables that we can kind of look into, but those are very important to give us a much more holistic understanding of how larger realities affect individual
Yeah.
outcomes.
Yeah. Of course, these are fairly very important questions. I think we've come to the last question,
Yeah.
and this is again very general in nature. So we've been talking about violence, identities, its impact on mental health. So do you know of any such collectives or research groups in universities or otherwise, that have been focusing on such themes or like doing research on themes?
uh, and do you mean in India?
I mean, anywhere, could be anywhere.
Yeah, anywhere there are quite a few.
Okay.
There's been there is a very, I mean, there's a lot of, there's an invested group of scholars in Israel, for instance, who've done a lot of interesting work on intergroup conflict, identity, memory, a lot of that. A significant amount of my work is actually takes from Israel-Palestine, and a lot of work that has happened on Israel-Palestine. So there is the IDC, Interdisciplinary Center, Herzliya, which is where Iran Halperin works, who has been working on conflict for a long time, and he has, you know, colleagues and postdocs and scholars. So that's a center completely, you know, focused on intergroup conflict, for one, for instance. There's a lot of interesting work happening in Europe. In the US, there is at University of Amherst, University of Massachusetts Amherst, they have a Center for Peace and Conflict, which was actually one of the first and most active centers doing this kind of research, which was because the head of that center was someone who is a very well-known name in this area, Linda Trop. She's very well-known. So that again is a center, the Center for Peace and Conflict Research, if I'm not wrong, University of Massachusetts Amherst. There are many other places, but these are two that come to my mind.
Yeah.
In India, I think, if I'm not wrong, though um, I've not really actively done any work with them, but I heard that there's of course a center at Jamia, which has been there for a long time. There's a center on peace studies. You know, in Jamia we have these different centers. There's a center on minority studies. There's a center on peace studies. There's a center on several others. So there's a center for, I think it's called Nelson Mandela Center for Peace and Conflict, if I'm not wrong.
Okay.
That's been active for a long time. That's there at Jamia. Second is, I think there is a center at ISC, Bangalore. I think not how do you, Indian Institute of Science. So I think
Okay.
they have a center on peace and conflict. I was told by a colleague, I'm not sure, but apparently they're doing some work there. Yeah, I don't think I know
Yeah,
of too many
that's okay. Yeah, that's okay.
collectives, but I definitely don't know of any independent collectives that are doing work like this. Because if you, and I do have to share this because this is again very, very significant to what you are asking, but also significant to my own journey. Because when I completed my master's, and like I think I mentioned right at the beginning, the interest was growing. When I completed my master's, I wanted to work with an organization that's working on conflict. Okay, so I found a couple of them online, and I had written to them saying that this is my area and this I'm interested in. And one of them, which is you know, if you look for Peace and Conflict India, I think that center kind of shows up, wrote back and said that that they don't have a place, they don't really have psychologists as part of their this thing, which I found at that time to be very strange and
yeah.
disappointing at that time. But later, when I really thought about it, it is actually what drove me to start writing about this. The fact, and it was a center looking at conflict resolution, you know, conflict, everything, okay, which I ended up. But my main question of how can you understand, and I know that, and this is not just with this particular organization, in general, the idea of looking at conflict resolution, conflict peace has always been from this international relations, political science, economics even lens, but we are hardly talking about mental health and psychology there. And that's you know, one of the issues. So I definitely, independent organizations, I rarely know of any which are particularly focusing on peace and conflict, and specifically with this lens, looking at identity, discrimination, mental health outcomes, etc.
Yeah. Well, I think we've come to the end of this interview. It was very, very insightful. I personally learned a lot. Thank you so much for taking our time and doing this. Really appreciate it.
Thank you so
Um,
much.
yeah, just a small request or whatever it seems like. If you know of any such therapists or researchers, like you said, you have some few colleagues who are focusing on themes like this and who would be interested to speak to us, it'd be really lovely to connect to them. So,
Okay,
I mean, yeah, if you'd have
I
some
will
suggestions,
definitely,
please
yeah.
free. Yeah,
Yeah,
but
yeah.
thank
I'll
you.
write to you and I'll let you know, and I'll maybe definitely put you in touch with Rashmi. I
Yeah.
think her work will be very, very relevant to. Yeah.
course. Thank you. We will have the full record sent to you, and once you approve it, we will upload it on our YouTube page.
Okay.
Right.
Thank you so
Thank
much.
you so
Yeah.
much.
Bye.
Thank you,
Bye.
Professor. Bye.